Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this next presentation looking at the recent updates on the science with regards to white fibrous clots. For anyone who has followed me, I've been talking about this for a number of years, and I recognize the challenge with regards to addressing this topic. It is very easy for the scientific community to just consider this a conspiracy. And as a result, it has always been a challenge to discuss this topic. However, when recently there have been a number of papers that have been published, it raises the point that we are no longer talking about whether or not they exist, but what really is the mechanism for them forming. And I've got with me today Tom Haviland, who was integral in terms of driving the research and the surveys, and he'll talk about the paper that he's had. And I've got Dr. Shankara Shetty, who has always been discussing with various people about the different kinds of classes of clots and why, and I always value his opinion. A quick reminder as housekeeping, coming up in the next few days is Gut Health After COVID. An inflammatory signal is occurring. I'll be going through the science and the likely drivers. If you are interested or know someone who is suffering, please look at the link and we will then be able to join me at that time. So without further ado, let's bring in Dr. Shetty and Tom Haviland. And I'll start off with you, Tom. Just a quick introduction to the audience in case they are not aware of who you are.
Yeah, Dr. McMillan, thanks for having me on the show. I'm a retired U.S. Air Force major, did 20 years in the United States Air Force, followed by 16 years after that as a defense contractor working with the Air Force. During that 36 years, I was a electrical engineer and data analyst. I have a mathematics degree from the Ohio State University, a electrical engineering degree from Louisiana Tech, and a master's in computer resources and information management from Webster University in St. Louis. This is a very interesting thing that's going on. I watched that Died Suddenly movie in the fall of 2022 and saw the 6 or 7 embalmers in that film that said they were seeing these very unusual white fibrous clots in their corpses. So I thought that was a very interesting thing. I know there were some problems with the film when it aired, but there was an amazing statement made at the 13-minute and 15-second mark. An embalmer from the state of Indiana, a Mr. Wallace Hooker, had been lecturing at an Ohio Embalmers Association conference in Columbus, Ohio in October of 2022. And he was lecturing to a room full of 100 embalmers. And in the movie, he says he showed them photographs of these same white fibrous clots that he had been pulling out of his corpses for about the last year at that time. And he said, by a show of hands, how many of you are seeing these same white fibrous clots? And he said almost the entire room of 100 embalmers raised their hands, yes, Dr. McMillan. So I took that information. I called the Ohio Embalmers Association the next day. I wasn't sure whether these embalmers were a bunch of kooks or not in this Died Suddenly film. And would you believe it or not, within 24 hours, the vice president of the Ohio Embalmers Association, Mr. Woody Wilson, said he was indeed seeing the white fibrous clots too. So I had corroboration from a professional.
We'll come back to that, Tom. And I just wanted to make sure I got Shankara to just do a quick introduction for himself as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Shankara Shetty. I'm a natural life science biologist and a general medical practitioner. I was a frontline COVID doctor to try to understand the pathophysiology through observation of the clinical picture. And that made me a COVID narrative disruptor. So I think I'm well known for that.
Excellent. So what I'll ask you to do now, Tom, is to give us shortly this background, because I've got here the paper. This has been published the 7th of July, 2026, self-reported observations of unusual white fibrous structures in embalmed corpses, looking at the period 2022 to 2025 across 5 countries. So this is where you give us an idea, Tom, as to how you, as an independent, just as a member of the public, ended up leading this kind of international research, where you are now an independent published researcher, scientific researcher. And just give us an idea as to how this happened for you.
Yeah, after I talked to the vice president of the Ohio Embalmers Association, Mr. Woody Wilson, who corroborated that he was seeing these same white fibrous clots in corpses that he was embalming in his funeral home in Marysville, Ohio, about an hour north of where I live in Dayton, Ohio, I decided right away, Dr. McMillan, that I needed to do a survey, a worldwide survey of embalmers to see how prevalent and the timing of these white fibrous clots, because I had a sneaking suspicion that our own FDA and CDC would not be looking into this problem. So with the help of my assistant, Miss Laura Kasner, who runs our wonderful Substack, we call it Clotastrophe, we ran a Survey Monkey survey that we sent out to, we used a two-prong approach. We sent it out to 50 national, regional, and state funeral director associations around the world, each with hundreds of members under them, asking them to forward the survey down to their active embalmers. We also then sent the email with the link to the survey directly to over 1,700 funeral homes around the world in major cities, asking the funeral directors of those funeral homes to have their embalmers take the survey. Probably should have had about 5,000 embalmers take the surveys each year had everybody responded. We didn't get quite that many, and the total of 4 years we've done the survey, starting in 2022 through 2025, we've had a total of 808 embalmers take the survey, and we've had shocking results to that survey.
And quickly, Shankara, when you first started hearing about this, what did you make of it?
Philip, it was a very strange phenomenon. We saw the embalmers removing these clots, but I was of the opinion that they were formed ante-mortem. We were concerned that it might be a post-mortem clot. But I was more of the opinion that it was ante-mortem because it was found in a specific part of the body. It wasn't found generally distributed throughout the body like it would occur. And I think it required for it to grow blood flow. And so I was of the opinion that it's ante-mortem. I also was aware that we had a virus and a vaccine making strange proteins in our body. And so I was of the opinion that it's likely proteinaceous, seeing that it's white and a thick calamari kind of clot. And I guess from there, we had to try and figure out what was triggering the process. Why was this kind of thing forming? And why was it ante-mortem and not presenting with overt symptoms? That was the one thing that fascinated me. We had clots that were feet long, occluding almost the entire vein, but it didn't show symptoms in the leg itself. The patient had no symptoms of that clot being there. It was an incidental finding through the embalmers. It wasn't actually the reason for the mortality. So that was a confusing thing to look into, to figure out why was that happening.
I think it's important for people to understand why this is unique with regards to the embalmers, because in order for them to do their embalming procedure, they have to remove a large proportion of the blood so that the body doesn't decompose. And so they are using a pump to pump it through and then extract the blood. And so therefore that will be left with embalming fluid going in. So they are very uniquely placed to see these clots, because a pathologist won't necessarily be doing that. And so I was very surprised that the scientific community were willing to ignore this very unusual pattern that they were raising awareness of, simply because other doctors or scientists weren't seeing this. But I was saying nobody else is really going to see this except the embalmers. Tom, what is your thought on that?
Yeah, you're right. In fact, the embalmers, Dr. McMillan, have been frustrated over the last 5 years, because when they run into a body that's riddled with these clots, typically, before COVID and the vaccines, they would have to use only one injection site point on the body in order to get the blood out and put the formaldehyde in. But now when they run into a body that's riddled with these clots, they have to use multiple injection site points, in the neck, under the armpits, in the iliac vein and artery down in the pelvis region, in the legs. And it's actually lengthened the time that it takes to do an embalming from about an hour to an hour and a half that it used to take to now 2 to 2.5 hours when they run into a body that's riddled with the clots. So the embalmers are not happy about the situation either.
Yeah, and so this is from your paper where you have, do you remember which embalmer, or does it?
These are all provided by embalmer Richard Hirschman. Richard has, by the way, 250 photos of clots taken out of over 250 different people, Dr. McMillan. So this is it's an incredible phenomenon. And one of the reasons we chose these three pictures is if you look at the upper left, you'll see the clots look more kind of gelatinous in nature. And we believe they may be in a intermediate stage and not fully matured yet. When you look at the clot on the upper right, though, you can see that it's more dry and rubbery. It looks like it's more solid and fully formed. And you can actually see the branches running off it, like, the tributaries off of the main part of whatever vein or artery that came out of. So it's really, they're forming cast of that particular portion of the vascular system, which is very interesting. And then at the bottom, you can see that they're sometimes pinkish in color too, which I think means that they've probably captured at least some of the red blood cells, or have been captured in that portion of that particular white or off-whitish fibrous clot.
Yeah, I've got a question here that's interesting, Shankar. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts from a radiographic standpoint. Is the clotting both pre and post-mortem, or has no one looked at it that way? So this is someone who is new to the discussion. So they may not have realized that we had a whistleblower. Remember our whistleblower who came. I still don't know who he is, so to speak. So it's important to know I can't corroborate the evidence. He sent the images. There are a lot of images of some very large, complex clots that were removed by embolectomy. And so we know that it occurs ante-mortem as well, as you had predicted, Shankara. What would you say to this skeptical radiologist who is not necessarily seeing it all the time?
Is the skepticism, Philip, that it is only post-mortem?
Well, I guess this is the question. I'm just saying that many radiologists may say if they had these clots and they did an angiogram, they would see it.
I think, Philip, it talks to the mechanism with how these clots are forming. Are they forming and generally occluding the vessel itself, or are they allowing blood flow? And so they won't present with distal symptoms of occlusion. My initial theory, Philip, was that we're dealing with a polymerization process that triggered by a catalyst. And why would it occur in one vessel, not in multiple vessels around the body? So I was of the opinion that some kind of endothelial injury acts as the nidus to trigger it, and you get protein formation on it, and you got some kind of catalytic process where, as blood flows through that initiated process of a protein sticking to the vessel wall, it starts to grow. And as Tom has shown, there's an evolution to the growth. So there's a chemical process that's occurring that evolves over time. So I was of the opinion that this keeps growing into almost a ribbon that is floating around in the blood flow downstream of, attached to the wall, but downstream of where the original started. So it can grow to a great length in that flow of blood without actually occluding it. But it keeps growing in length and it keeps growing in width. And if you look at so it will take the cast of the vessel as it grows. But if you look at the images that Tom has shown, you'll see some have tubular structures, some have ribbon-like structures. So they can grow to great length without occluding the flow of blood by allowing blood to circulate past them. And so you don't get the distal ischemic issues that you have. So it's like
so it doesn't obstruct the blood vessel fully.
Yeah, it's almost like getting a calcium deposit on a pipe. The blood still flows, but you got this calcium cast around it.
And Dr. McMillan, I have some proof as well. I've been in touch with an endovascular specialist and cardiologist from Jacksonville, Florida, Dr. Mahana Basharat, who actually sent me photographs of a white fibrous clot that he removed from a living person in his cath lab in March of 2024. And you can see the white fibrous clot still covered in blood. It could look kind of pinkish, and the cord running down through the middle of the clot. And then he also sent me the angiograms of what it looked like when it was in the body and when the clot was removed and blood flow was successfully restored. So that was a successful procedure. Now, in terms of post-mortem, can the clots form? Over the last several years, Richard Hirschman has had several cases of corpses that came to him with external tubing on the person, where they had, I think, what was called ECMO treatment. And what's interesting is white fibrous clot material formed in those ECMO tubes that was a larger diameter than some of the input tubes that came into a larger tube. So that's evidence that the clots can form post-mortem as well. So we have evidence from doctors and vascular surgeons and endovascular specialists that this is occurring in the living, and that we also have evidence that they can form post-mortem as well. So we believe it's both.
Excellent. Yeah. So this is quite a challenging concept. And one of the things I'm going to show you something here, Shankar, before I come back to the Tom's paper. And I realize I've been seeing this quite a lot, and I have never done any research around it. And so, truthfully, I haven't taken the scientific method. I've just kind of let it pass. Have you been seeing people talking about this? Can you see that with 5G? I'm just curious. Am I the only person who has never really applied any thought to this?
Look, I think, Philip, there's a lot that goes on around us that we don't, as medical healers, understand. We look at chemistry. Our allopathic medical system just looks at chemistry. But if you look at what the entirety of human health entails, it is frequency, it is electricity, it is water technology, it is heat and how that is that transmits. So I think a lot of things influence the human body that we've not been cognizant of in the past, and that's where we sit today, with a very narrow view of what health actually is from an allopathic chemistry perspective. But if you look just at water, Philip, water is considered a random substance, so it's like a crowd of people walking around aimlessly. But when you put water under charge, it becomes structural. It's no more just water. Now, water in a battery is different from water just lying around. So it's like taking a loud hailer to that crowd and getting them all to look at you. It's no more just a random crowd. Every cell in our body has an electrical charge. So all the water in our body is not actually liquid water. It's crystalline water. It's organized. But we study water outside the human body without the influence of electricity and hope we'd find what it actually does. So I think, yeah, if we look closely enough, we'll figure out what the term holy water means. And so, yeah, there's a lot we don't know. So I don't think we should discount things like 5G in its ability to influence the human body and physiology. We don't understand how 5G works. We've never taken the time to understand how these electromagnetic frequencies influence general human health. So people with nefarious agendas can use particular frequencies to trigger particular processes. And so, yeah, from what we've seen with COVID, Philip, I don't think anything's a conspiracy theory. The broadest curiosity will give us the answers. And so, yeah, let's not discount anything too readily.
It was a very good point. Yes, excellent point. So, Tom, what I wanted to ask you is, in relation to the paper here, I want you to explain to me about what you were trying to achieve, or what happened here in terms of these numbers. You can see here 2022, 23, 24, 25, Embalmers, and looking at reported. Just explain what this is about here.
Yeah, the main four findings of our surveys over the last 4 years, basically, like I said, we say this is a worldwide phenomenon, because we did have embalmers in all 4 countries, or 5 countries, the United States, Canada, UK, and Australia, and New Zealand, say that they were seeing this phenomenon. And what's interesting is, you can see there in the chart, it's the majority of embalmers that are seeing this phenomenon each year. In fact, if you sum up the total of the embalmers that took the studies, or the surveys, you get 808 embalmers taking the surveys, 608 of which said they are indeed seeing the white fibrous clots in that third column there. And then when you ask them what percentage of your corpses have these phenomena, these white fibrous clots, you can see the percentages, vary between 19 to 27% of corpses. So the average being 23% of corpses. So this is not a rare phenomenon.
And why was there a significant fall off in 2025?
That's a good question, Dr. McMillan. And I'm not quite sure. I think we may be in a situation where embalmers now are, I know some people have gotten tired of the whole COVID subject. They want to move on from this, And also, I think they're in a little bit of a dilemma, because a lot of these embalmers, they were hoping probably that the phenomenon would disappear as we got further and further away from the early years of the COVID pandemic. But because the clots are still persistent, now they're in a dilemma, because if they come out now and say that they're seeing the white fibrous clots, people will first applaud them and say, wonderful, I'm glad you came forward finally. But where were you 4 or 5 years ago when you first started seeing these things, and people like Richard Hirschman and others who were speaking out early could have used your help in corroborating this. You know, what's interesting is I recently returned from I was a guest speaker on the 31st of May at the Tennessee Funeral Director Association's annual convention in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And this was the second year in a row. They invited me back this year again, Dr. McMillan. That's how concerned they are about this phenomenon. And I actually ran a survey again this year at that convention, and 70% of the embalmers responding to that survey said they were seeing the white fibrous clots in about 18 or 19% of their corpses in the first half of 2026. So they're alarmed about this. And in fact, we talked to many embalmers while we were at convention. Richard Hirschman went with me to this convention. And when the embalmers talk to you privately, they say they are seeing the clots. They don't want to come out publicly and talk about it, not even now in 2026, but they will tell you privately they're seeing them. In fact, there was a school that was there, a mortuary school, had about 15 of their students they brought in to listen to the presentation that Richard Hirschman and I gave. And we talked to them, some of them, after the presentation, and to their instructor. And their instructor said that she is indeed teaching them about the white fibrous clots and that this is a new phenomenon in their mortuary school. So
yeah.
Interesting.
You know, Shankar, I have had some thoughts over the years, and one of them is that those kind of clots, if they are present in arteries or even veins, are not really compatible with a healthy person. So the first thing I'd like to say to people is that a lot of people start worrying, do I have these clots in me? And my feeling is that if you did, you would be sick. You wouldn't be just wandering around having a bit of a headache and feeling tired. These people have got to be very sick. And so part of the question is, are embalmers seeing this because the people who have this occur invariably die? The large majority, unless they have some kind of procedure. Any thoughts about that from a clinical point of view, Shankar?
Philippa, we haven't seen the clots actually manifest in emboli that are consequential on a broad scale. So it shows that as much as these clots grow to great extent, they allow a percentage of blood flow through the vessel itself. They're not completely occlusive. Now, when we talk of percentage of flow, if you're walking around aimlessly the whole day, you're not really pushing your engine to the maximum and requiring the maximum flow. So people with sedentary lifestyles that don't really exercise or push their bodies to the limit might not notice that there's a compromise to circulation in a particular area. And that might let it go unchallenged. As well, for people with comorbidities, people with other conditions those other conditions might increase their propensity to develop these kind of clots. So it might not be that they're inactive that causes the clots. It might be that they have other chronic comorbidities that make them more, they can develop the clots far more easily than healthy patients. So there's a lot of different factors at play. I think the data collection is vitally important, looking at age, looking at blood groups, documenting vaccine status. All these different things will show us patterns. And that's where we'll know where to start looking.
You know,
Well, just before you go on with that, Tom, because this was from the whistleblower. When the whistleblower who was doing embolectomies in the lab, this is one of the clots that he showed. And I'm telling you, if they did not take out this clot, this person would have died. Yeah. So this is what I'm saying, is that it's not compatible for someone to have a clot this big and be okay. This is what I mean, is that I just can't see. This is why I think that it's what they are observing. I wish I could get the history with regards to what was happening to that patient who has the clots in the week before they died. What was the mechanism of death? You know, was it respiratory? Was it a sudden thing? Were they short of breath? You know, there's so many valuable pieces of information we could gather if we knew what was happening prior to them prior to them dying. Tom, sorry, you were going to say something.
I was just saying, I'm familiar with one anecdotal case where a young guy, I think in between 20 and 30 years old, was hiking in the Rockies, I believe, with his mom, and did a full week of that. And then she was flying back to her home in the eastern United States. And when she arrived, she found out her son was going into the hospital, and he wound up passing away with one of these white clots in him. And they had just got done with a pretty heavy week of exercising, like I said, walking, hiking up through the Rocky Mountains. So, and I think that's why they call the film Died Suddenly, because people may feel asymptomatic, feel just fine as long as the blood's able to flow around the clots. But at the moment that it eventually does occlude or block completely a critical vein or artery, that's when you get your died suddenly. So I'm not sure either, Dr. McMillan. It looks impossible, like you say, when you look at those photographs. How in the world can somebody have that inside them and not know it's inside them? But I think as long as blood's still able to flow around, they may feel just fine, asymptomatic, until that moment comes where it completely gets blocked, and then you get your stroke or heart attack.
The reason I ask those questions is because since I've been observing these patterns, I have been very carefully studying patient presentation. And what I'm observing is that the start of symptoms before somebody gets really sick is sometimes a week or two with what appears to be mild symptoms. Not even a temperature, just fatigue is almost always there, and headaches. That's literally sometimes all you see. And then 3 weeks down the line, the person has a major event. That's when they could have a clot in their lungs, or they have a stroke, or they have a heart attack, or something like that. And so it seems to indicate that the process does occur over a period of time, rapidly accelerating, but people can discount the symptoms until pretty late in the process. Have you noticed anything like that, Shankara?
Philip, if I look at how we're going to examine the presentation, which, as you mentioned, is very important in understanding what led up to the death of the patient, because these are new observations that are going to give us insight to save lives in the future. But I think what the process actually is, Philip, in the white fibrinous clots, we don't see a cascading clotting issue. You're not seeing clotting products in them. You're seeing proteins. And so in understanding that, when a patient has a traditional clot, it starts off with fatigue because there is an occlusion to blood, not occlusion, but a compromise to blood flow. So it'll create fatigue in a limb, or if it's close to the heart, generalized fatigue. And that will, clotting tends to progress relatively quickly. So clots grow, those current jelly red clots that Tom speaks about. They can grow pretty rapidly. They don't grow in length, they grow in width, and then they occlude the vessel very suddenly. And that's a sudden heart attack. And you can see it brewing for a couple of weeks. But I think what's happening with this process being proteinaceous, because of blood flow, you're getting deposition on this initiated process, and the pressure of the blood keeps pushing it through. So where blood is flowing at high flow, high speed, it won't be able to stick to the structure. But where there are areas of stasis, it'll start to stick. So I think the nature of the fibrin clots growing allows for blood flow. They don't grow widthwise and occlude. They tend to grow longer and longer and longer, but it allows, as blood flows through, if you occlude half the vessel, the other half of the vessel where blood is flowing has twice the pressure. And so it won't block up that easily. So this will start to grow in areas of lower pressure, which really doesn't compromise the high pressure of the blood flow. And if you look at blood flow, Philip, blood tends to flow in a very laminar formation. And so the coagulation of this clot, which is heavy in structure, will keep in the center of the vessel, because that's where
Yeah.
the great source is. And so you'll have blood trying to push its way around it. So we can get great lengths that are not occlusive. But remember, in those areas where blood is pushing through, you got turbulence. So all you need is a traditional blood clot to form somewhere along this clot, which is what Tom was showing us, red clots along the fibrinous clot. So it might be the turbulence caused by the fibrinous clot that triggers a coagulation cascade of traditional clotting, which causes the sudden death. But that fibrinous clot might have been there for a long time with blood flowing past.
The reason why I asked, somebody pointed out here, what are the clots made of? What is their composition? And it's important to note that there are other scientists who are trying to do quite detailed analysis of the proteins. But I was going to show one of the very early bits of the protein characteristics. And it's important to note that one of the standout things that came up was that when you looked at the comparison, say, between fibrinogen beta and fibrinogen alpha, it's like 3 times the amount of one of the chains. The same thing happens with hemoglobin beta versus hemoglobin alpha, because normally they're in they're equal amounts, but for some reason in these clots you have 3 times the amount of one chain versus the other. This is likely to be very complicated. I don't know how else to say it. Is that, and this is part of the worry, is that because there is so little movement from the major scientific institutions who should be looking at this, we are 4 or 5 years behind the line. What has been your experience, Tom, when you've been pushing the major agencies?
It's been pathetic, frankly, Dr. McMillan. Every year I've had the surveys done, starting in the end of 2022 into 2023. All 4 years I've sent the results of my surveys immediately to the NIH, CDC, and FDA. Crickets over those 4 years, gentlemen. They have never responded to any of my survey results. And to my knowledge, they haven't done any surveys of their own. They haven't reached out to funeral directors, funeral homes, vascular surgeons, endovascular specialists that work in cath labs. They're just do not seem to be interested in this topic. It's just, it's tragic. And it's not just them, not just the FDA, CDC, and NIH. The Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Stanford. Why aren't they investigating this? Why aren't they getting their own samples of these unusual white fibrous clots? Trust me, gentlemen, there's plenty of samples available from embalmers all over the world, but they do not want to get samples of these clots and do their own scientific analysis of them to either confirm or refute what Mr. Greg Harrison and his team that Richard and I are in contact with have done out of their own private pocket testing on the clots.
I think one of the questions that I'm going to put in front of you, Shankara, from an article that had recently come out, looking at the trust in scientific institutions, because the truth is, for me, even if one of the major institutions, say for instance, looked at this and they then said, no, this is nothing, it's not different from a normal clot, it's okay, it's just a much ado about nothing, move on, would I believe them? Would I trust them? And the truth is, the answer is no, I would not. And so it raises a question as to whether or not we would even trust major institutions looking at it at this time and not giving clear answers. So this article was just recently published on the 1st of July, 2026 in Nature. Have people stopped trusting the science? And the data, it says, tells a surprising story. And when they looked at generally, I'll just show you the graphs here so that you understand the countries that support science the most. Egypt and India, interesting, Shankara. And drifting down, China is right about in the middle. Albania really doesn't trust science. Russia towards that side as well. And then when you look at trust in professionals, doctors are still at the top, then scientists, then teachers, then members of the armed forces. At the bottom here are politicians, probably rightly so. But it was very interesting that they mentioned something here in terms of the fractures in trust. Because when you look here, confidence in science in the US, when we look at the year, and this is what you have to look at here, this is 2020, confidence was stable. And then there was this major drop off in a great deal of confidence after the pandemic. This would have been probably lockdowns, masks, and so on. A lot of people had some confidence instead of a great deal of confidence. And then there was a huge surge in hardly any confidence. And they made the point here is that when you actually looked at this bit here, and I think this is important for people to read, it says here that the proportion of people with confidence in scientists to act in the public's interest fell from 87% in 2020 to 73% in 2023. So it's not just that people have a lack of confidence in science, they have a lack of confidence in scientists to act in the public's interest. Any thoughts about that, Shankara?
I think that's a valid point, Philip. We had people during the pandemic who were well educated in different fields, who claimed to be experts and custodians of the relevant science. Now, for the layman on the street who doesn't understand the scientific literature, he looks to these experts to give him a layman's view of what's actually going on. Now, unfortunately, the scientists seem to have been, or the doctors, propagandized by the politicians to abuse the trust that was built in them. And so we've had people come out with nonsensical statements. But even for a layman, Philip, science is science. It can be questioned. It can be refuted. When you look at a scientific study, if you have the ability, you can go through it and make sure that it's logically done. It comes to a logical conclusion. There are no confounders in it. So science is meant to be challenged. It's meant to be discussed. It's meant to be that's science. But unfortunately, during the pandemic, we could interrogate the science, but we couldn't and weren't allowed to interrogate the scientists. And that is where the problem lay. So I saw things in scientific literature that made no sense, but I was not allowed to share it with the public because the scientists had a different view of what I was seeing. And that's bad science if we can't question each other and look at each other's views. So I would say that the decrease in the trust of scientists is warranted because there are scientists around the world who stood up and spoke truth. And so the trust in those scientists or in the science is still there. I think people realize that a lot of what the propaganda was spread was unscientific. There was illogic. So I guess with humanity, those that are lazy to look at the logic will just follow the experts. And that's what happened. The complacency of society made them listen to one view. We were censored and called conspiracy theorists, so they didn't have a balanced view of everything. And so they followed the common narrative. So the scientists that were pushing this forward have a lot to answer for and should be quite embarrassed that they got it that wrong, seeing that they call scientists and are the custodians of good science and knowledge. So I'm looking to see people acknowledge that they made mistakes and redirect. But unfortunately, when you have that amount of trust and that upper echelons of society, ego plays a big part in admitting fault. And so, yeah, I'm wondering whether that will ever come and there'll be a redirection.
You know, Tom, I wanted you to explain a little bit more to the audience with regards to the paper and this section of the paper here. I'm just going to show it to you, where they were looking at what years have you observed the large whitish fibrous structures. Explain to the audience what really you are looking at here.
Yeah, we asked this question only the first year of the survey at the end of 2022. We didn't ask it in years after that because it would have been more difficult for embalmers to recall what happened, 3-4 years prior to that. So we asked this question only one time in our 2022 survey. Of the 179 that took the survey, 119 said they saw the clots, 60 said they did not. So that's that green bar, the 60 that said they did not observe the clots at all. Interestingly, I had put 2018 and 2019 on there as control years, expecting none of the embalmers to answer they saw the clots in those years because of the anecdotal reports I was getting from embalmers. Everyone that I was talking to said they never saw these clots prior to the year 2020. But we did have a few that answered that. So I went back and I looked at my SurveyMonkey responses, gentlemen, and I saw that SurveyMonkey records the time that it takes for each person to do the survey. Almost all of those responses that said they saw the clots in 2018 and 2019 answered my survey. They should have taken 3 or 4 minutes to take because there was like 10 questions in a comments box. They took only 30 seconds to 1 minute to do the survey. So I think that they rushed through the survey. They may have had some preconceived notions about how they wanted to answer the survey, even, ignoring the questions. They may also have ignored my instructions. I said at the beginning of the survey, these are white fibrous clots are not to be distinguished or or confused with chicken fat clots, which are much smaller, yellowish in color and tear easily. So they may have not seen that instruction because they zipped through the survey so fast. But what's interesting is in the year 2020, see that year, now we have 44 of the embalmers, a significant number said they started seeing the white fibrous phenomenon in that year. And as you gentlemen know, that's the year that we had the COVID virus, but no vaccines yet. But then in those last two bars, you see starting in 2021 and 2022, the bar explodes, right? The majority of the embalmers, of the 119 that said they saw the clots, 95 of them said they saw it in 2021, and then 109 out of the 119, about 93% said they saw the white fibrous clots in the year 2022. So I'm not saying what that, causation or correlation is not necessarily causation, but we all know something happened in 2020 and then something else happened in 2021. And it tends to jive with the responses I got from the embalmers.
So I'm going to raise a question here. And this is a thought that I was expanding on just prior to coming on this discussion as I was reflecting, because I've been looking at the science for some time. So the first question that I realized as I went through, I thought to myself, where would we be likely to see this kind of pattern occurring? Because as I said, this is primarily an embalmers issue. So I then went and looked at where in the world embalmers is very common. Interestingly, the Philippines has a very high rate of embalming, and it would be worthwhile, Tom, checking to see if embalmers in the Philippines are seeing something. That would be very useful. New Zealand, I think you said you had asked, but they weren't particularly interested.
We do have one point of contact. Mr. Brenton Faithful is a funeral director and embalmer in New Zealand, who was actually featured as one of the embalmers 6 or 7 in the Died Suddenly movie. Brenton said he was indeed seeing the white fibrous clots and still is.
Right.
So we have a New Zealand point of contact.
And then you can see USA, UK, France, and Canada. You got most of your responses from the USA and Canada. Probably not much from France.
I did not survey France. But in the UK, we did get some responses from the UK, and we also have a point of contact there. Mr. John O'Looney and his embalmer have been seeing the white fibrous clots in their corpses in his Milton Keynes, England funeral home. And we also have a point of contact in Canada. Miss Laura Jeffries has been seeing the white fibrous clots in her corpses that she's been embalming. I also, the president of the Manitoba, Canada Funeral Service Association, Mr. Kevin Swire, sent me an email saying he was seeing the white fibrous clots in his corpses. And like I said, he's been the president of that association of the entire province of Manitoba for about the last 4 or 5 years.
So I'm going to come back to Shankara here. And I did an exercise, as I said, in the past few hours, just before we came on. I asked myself the question, have we heard of embalmers clots in India? Okay. Now, I think there's some logistic issues because India doesn't really do embalming. But as far as I know, I have never heard of anything in India. And you can tell us, Shankar, because you understand Indian culture and so on. If they were seeing something, would they be talking about it?
I think, Philip, they would be. India is very open to sharing such information. I think throughout the pandemic, we saw that they were willing to state observations, willing to look at clinical picture. I found, look, India bases its healthcare system on doctors' knowledge, their observations. So a lot of advances in India come from observational data, what doctors observe, not randomized clinical trials. And so in India, if there were these kind of plots, I'm sure they would have been reported. But I haven't heard anything. And then from India as well, Philip, they tend to stayed away from the mRNA technology. So I think when we look at the process of the formation of clots, okay, in India, you got different religious groups, some cremate, some bury, some embalm. And so you got to look at which cohort you're looking at and how to get that data from them. But as well, Philip, when you look at the clots that formed itself, there's different things that could have triggered this process of clot formation. If you look at what we're dealing with as a broad addition to the pandemic, there was spike protein from the virus and the vaccine. There was lipid nanotechnology, which was new, that was used in the vaccine. There was also mRNA technology that was new to human population. So we got to figure out which of all these new products put into the human body actually triggered the process. And of course, to do that, you want uniform cohorts to compare. Now, if you look at a country like India and you find there's none of these embalmers clots, then we can rule out spike protein because that's common across the board. And then you'd start looking at lipid nanotechnology and mRNA that was absent from the vaccinations in that country. So I think we need to get homologous data when it comes to the type of vaccines used so that we can rule out certain ingredients of the vaccine as the cause of the pathology. The problem that we're going to have, Philip, is that the countries that were vaccinated with Pfizer, if they turn out to be a predominant cause in the clots, Pfizer has a host of contaminants in the vials itself. And so we can't just look at the lipid nanoparticles, the messenger RNA, and spike protein production. There's a whole lot of other stuff in that, contaminants in that might be triggering the process. So I think good data collection is vital.
The reason I had highlighted India, so I went and I got an interesting bit of data looking at what was done in terms of the platforms in India. So this is why India is so interesting. 2.21 billion doses, of which they use 79% adenoviral vector vaccines, or inactivated whole virus, Covaxin, 16%, and then a small percentage of 3.3% of protein-based. Now, there seems as though there was an issue at the time with regards to the licensing of mRNA vaccines in India, and so they opted not to use it, and they stuck with vaccines that they had largely made themselves. Now, the reason I think this is so important is because if there is a connection with the platform, as opposed to, because all that we have focused on has been the spike protein. So the same question I would be asking of China. So China primarily used whole virus vaccines. Did they also have any kind of patterns with regards to unusual clotting? Now, the problem is if China doesn't do embalming, or if India doesn't do embalming, but they will probably embalm bodies that are used in medical schools. So they will do it at some point. But if those countries are not seeing it at all, that is definitely a red flag that suggests that our focus on the spike protein may actually be a mistake. And this is why I'm saying that the science really needs to be done. Any thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah, and we also have to keep in mind another confounder, which is the COVID virus itself, right? Because if the spike protein from the COVID virus can cause these white fibrous clots, you may see that in populations that did not take any of the COVID mRNA vaccines. So that's another confounder that we have to consider, right? And you're right. We need to have more investigation, analysis done of this phenomenon. And the team that I've been working with Richard Hirschman, led by Mr. Greg Harrison in Sydney, Australia, have done a pretty good job on this. And they have all the testing they've done, the inductive coupled plasma mass spectrometry testing, the high performance liquid chromatography testing, the thioflavin T testing, recent Raman spectroscopy that's been done on the clots as well. Everything seems to be pointing to the spike protein as a potential culprit. We're not definitive yet, but it looks like it is still in the running as a potential culprit. But you're right. We also have to consider the phospholipid nanoparticles that deliver the mRNA vaccine as well. The team that we're working with believes at the moment that the phospholipid nanoparticle opens up to release the mRNA payload inside, that its phosphorus heads are then exposed, and they have a great affinity, we believe, for our natural blood clotting protein fibrinogen, which is causing this binding of the fibrinogen with not just the spike protein that becomes phosphorylated, but also these phospholipid nanoparticles. So that would tend to imply that no matter what the payload is inside future mRNA vaccines, whether it's for the RSV virus or the regular flu virus or whatever, that could also then trigger the formation of these unusual white fibrous clots. speculation at this point, but science is being done to try to either prove or disprove that. That's why it's so important the NIH and CDC need to get on the ball and do something.
Now, Shankara, those are some pretty big statements from Tom. And you can imagine that anybody who dares to actually try and do that kind of research, I mean, they'd never get the funding. They would have their funding pulled for everything else. I mean, how do we get out of this mess?
And I think, Philip, the research is pretty in depth. We're not dealing with a single point in time where something happens. It's an ongoing process. When Tom was talking about the virus and its ability to trigger this, and of course with the vaccine, we're dealing with an ongoing process. And of course, that ongoing process has an evolution, and it also has an evolutionary speed. So you might find that the virus does trigger an amyloidogenic protein ability, but the speed might be different. So you might have the amyloidogenicity of the virus and the vaccine and the lipid nanoparticle. They all create amyloid, but at different rates. So you might find people, depending on their exposures, developing the same kind of thing, but at different rates. And so I think the documentation of this, the investigation of it, is critical over a time frame, not just in a short space of time. You want to understand how it evolves. The fibrinous clots have a very distinct architecture to them with alpha and beta sheets. How do they grow? What triggers what? It's a polymerization process. Like Tom mentioned, the phosphates that are found in the lipid nanoparticles are actually a catalyst in a lot of chemical reactions. And so are they catalyzing a process of coagulation of amyloidogenic proteins? And so the production then starts to impact on the size of the clot, the length of the clot, and all that kind of thing. So when you look at the research needs to be pretty intense with a good understanding of what we observe, because the observations will dictate where we go. The problem is that a lot of the research facilities are funded by government, and because of that, a lot of the research gets directed by government. And we also know that the government was very integrated into the rollout of those vaccines and the narratives that were played out. We're seeing all the problems with that. So I don't think governments will be too eager to fund research that will show their incompetence and what they've actually done in the pandemic. So I don't think I'll pay to have myself investigated and jailed for a mistake I made. So I guess we're sitting at a crossroads where private funding is going to be the order of the day to find solutions.
Yeah, this is difficult. So I'll share with you some of the thoughts that as I said, I've done about 4 different presentations looking at the science around this. So as I was reflecting on it, one of the things that I came across was that central to a lot of the microclotting. So this is the important bit, is that microclotting is very real. And this is something that the Pretorius team in South Africa, Joachim has been looking at it as well with Dr. Beata in Germany. So microclotting is very real, and it seems to be amyloid based. Now, what we don't know is whether or not the microclotting that occurs is directly connected to the macro clotting that forms these large fibrous clots. So here is a thought I had, so you can critique it, please. One of the things I looked at is that I found a particular kind of macrophage or monocyte that circulates in the bloodstream, a THBS monocyte, and it's a scavenger. So it picks up anything that shouldn't be in the bloodstream. And so I hypothesized that I figure that when the macroclots start occurring, they are going to be occurring relatively quickly. I still suspect, when I say quickly, I mean over, say, a week. So my suspicion is that there is an infection trigger which causes an immune response in an already primed circulating monocyte, the THBS1, which can degrade red blood cells as well. And this monocyte would have been primed to target not just the spike protein, but because the spike protein can bind to hemoglobin and fibrin, it could then trigger a combination immune response that then creates a coagulation cascade. This is the image that I kind of created. This is the priming, because if you had it circulating in the bloodstream, it's picked up by these monocytes. At the same time, while it's doing its normal clearing work with fibrin and red blood cells, this all becomes a priming mechanism. Then when there is re-exposure of spike protein from reinfection or otherwise, you then get an explosion of an immune response, which leads to this unusual protein white clot. That's my kind of idea today. Okay, tomorrow I'll probably have something else, but that's the thought today.
I think, Philip, there is some validity to that. In that, with COVID, what you're talking about is an immune complex kind of disease, where immune complexes act as the glue to bind things with different receptors together, so it can attach to all the spike protein in all the different tissues and cause that kind of coagulation. But what confounds it is that this is a clot that grows. So it's stuck to the vessel wall. It's not flowing through. It occurs in that vessel only, and so there's some kind of deposition that's happening over and over and growing the clot. When you talk of immune complex disease, it can occur throughout the body wherever those immune complexes are made, and it can attack tissues around the body. This seems to be a very well located. I think we shouldn't use the word clot. We should use the word emboli, because clot will make us think of all the different products that are not there. So it's the formation of an embolus that seems to be triggered by something in the body. And I think there's likely to be multiple mechanisms at play. The trigger for it, Philip, might be something that is universal, means like an injury. So it can be triggered by an endothelial injury, can be triggered by a wide diversity of things that will trigger the cascade that forms the clot over a period of a week or 2 weeks. But that trigger might occur from different things. So we can't say those different things made the clot. Yeah, the person, like you said, was primed. They have the right proteins flowing to them, all waiting for the right signal to start to grow, fix to a nidus and start to grow. That trigger for it might be a wide, diverse range of things, because the trigger might not be a unique thing. But once triggered, the clot uniquely or the embolus uniquely grows. So yeah, I think there's a lot of research that needs to get done into how this actually forms.
So listen, guys, as we come towards the end here, I'm going to be asking some closing thoughts from Tom and Shankara. And just a reminder, in case you've joined us late, because there are quite a few people here now, and just a reminder that this is based on a now published study by Tom Haviland about the observation of unusual white fibrous structures in embalmed corpses over multiple 5 countries. And in case you'd not seen what it looks like, this is what some of the images that the embalmers had found. And Tom, just for the audience, can you show again your images that you have here at the moment? Hold on. Let's just get that up so you can roll it over, turn it around. So these are, it's quite strange. So this is white fibrous, not the typical red stuff that you have. That's a large one that is in formalin at the moment, isn't it?
Correct. This particular one here was it's about 5.5 inches long and about 1/2 inch wide. It was taken out of the abdominal aorta. It's one of the largest blood vessels in the body, taken out by a device called a trocar that embalmers use when they're actually removing liquids and gases from the cavity of a corpse so it doesn't bloat during, they want it to look nice during the presentation for the funeral. So it's shocking.
Yeah. So where do you want this to go now? What do you think needs to happen or should happen? Final thoughts, Tom, and then I'll ask Shankara.
Well, now that my paper has been accepted in a peer-reviewed journal, the International Journal of Innovative Research in Medical Science, along with a paper that was just authored by Daniel Santiago and Greg Harrison and his team about what the clots were composed of, and scientific testing and analysis on the clots, I think it's time for Senator Ron Johnson to have a hearing here in the United States, similar to the ones he's already done last year on myocarditis, the one he did about a month or so ago on turbo cancers. I think it's time that we have a hearing on the white fibrous clot issue where myself, some scientists, and funeral director association presidents of states like Pennsylvania that I mentioned earlier come forward and testify about the existence and prevalence of these white fibrous clots.
Excellent. And Shankara, any final thoughts?
I think, Philip, from a research perspective and trying to save lives and understand the new pathophysiology we're dealing with, I think there needs to be a significant investment in the research as to what these clots are, how they are formed, and how can we negate them. I think we've got a broad, diverse knowledge of human physiology, chemistry. So the first thing that needs to do is to completely get all the information as to what these clots are composed of. So chromatography. There's a wide diversity of different tests we could use to elicit the true structure of these clots. That will give us an understanding of how they formed. The chemistry of the clots can be played with in the lab to see what triggers them to actually coagulate. So that's not a difficult thing to do. Whether it's the lipid nanoparticle or messenger RNA or spike protein, we can expose the appropriate amyloid proteins to them and see what causes coagulation. So we can get to by good investment in research and really looking for the problem. We can find exactly what's going on and find solutions to it. But it requires significant interest and investment into figuring out why this unusual phenomena is actually occurring. And in doing that, we'll be able to prevent the death and destruction that we see around us.
Yes, excellent. So I want to thank everybody who is with us. And I appreciate all the comments. I'm just showing some of the comments that are there. Appreciate all the input that people have had. I hope we've answered as many questions as we could. Look out for more presentations. Most critically, make sure you raise awareness about this kind of discussion and help people to understand that this is real, the science is real, and the question now becomes, what does science do next? So thank you all very much, gentlemen, and I look forward to, I'm sure, talking to you again in the future. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye.